Hello and welcome to earlymusicsources.com. My name is Elam Rotem, and today we'll talk about a very spicy and very French chord. In a previous episode, we talked about the Neapolitan chord and showed that it wasn't used exclusively by Neapolitan composers, it was used by everyone. In fact, it is quite rare to have a musical phenomenon that is exclusive to a small group of composers. The chord we are going to discuss in this episode, however, is something of an exception. It was used very much specifically by French composers in the Baroque period, and became one of the beloved characteristics of their music. We will analyze this chord, enjoy its charms, and see how it was conceived by musicians back then. Let's start. So that we know what we're talking about, let's listen to 3 examples of our special chord. The first is taken from a piece by Louis Couperin, the uncle of the more famous François Couperin, from some time in the 1650s. The piece is a so-called unmeasured prelude, which is notated in a way that indicates the notes that should be played, but leaves the rhythm largely to the discretion of the player. Let's listen and focus on this chord. So it will be more comfortable to examine, let's take only the essential notes from this excerpt that are relevant for us and notate the resulting chord progression. We see that our chord includes the major third, augmented fifth, major seventh, and major ninth. Apart from the third, these intervals are not consonances. The seventh and the ninth are common dissonances that should be prepared and resolved, as they are. But the augmented fifth is a special interval. According to Renaissance counterpoint, it is simply forbidden, but in later French Baroque music theory, it is allowed under special treatment. Unlike normal dissonances, it resolves by ascending step and does not necessarily have to be prepared, though in this particular case it is. We also see that our chord is in proximity to a cadence in the key of A minor, which puts our chord, which is on C, on the 3rd degree of the minor scale. Lastly, we see that just before our chord, the bass is 1 step lower, on the 2nd degree of the scale. Try to remember these features when we look at the next examples. Our second example comes from some decades later, from Nicolas Lebègue's first book of organ music. Compared to the effect created when playing this chord on the harpsichord, the sustained notes of the organ make it even stronger. Let's listen. This is very similar to our first example. We see the same notes over the bass. We see that it appears on the 3rd degree of the minor scale just before a cadence, and that it is preceded by a bass on the 2nd degree. The only difference between the two examples is that while the 7th and 9th are prepared, the augmented 5th is not prepared. It is arrived at by step. Our third example is from more than half a century later, from the opera Dardanus by the famous Jean-Philippe Rameau. I'll play the orchestra parts on the harpsichord. Again, we have all our dissonances with the 7th and 9th prepared and the augmented 5th not. And again, it's on the 3rd degree in a minor scale just before a cadence, and the bass before it is on the 2nd degree. As you see, This same very special and distinct chord was used throughout the Baroque period by various French composers. In fact, this chord is so common that it is pretty hard to find a French Baroque composer who did not use it. As you will now see, however, this chord is not a fixed object. It can come in different flavors and colors. Let's see. Using basso continuo notation, we can summarize the features we have seen so far with this model in D minor. Now, in the literature, there are dozens of examples in which these features are varied slightly. For example, one doesn't have to use all three dissonances together. One may use only the augmented fifth and seventh without the ninth, as in this example by Nicolas Gigot. Or, as in another piece by the same composer, only the augmented fifth and the ninth without the seventh. Gigot also demonstrates that one might use only the augmented fifth, without any other dissonance. However, one might also find the opposite, that is, only the seventh and ninth without the augmented fifth. This creates an effect that is somewhat softer, but nevertheless feels like part of the same family as our chord. I'll play the orchestra parts from this overture by Jean-Baptiste Lully. Without the augmented fifth, clearly a distinct element of our chord, one might question whether this variant should be included here at all. However, since all the other features are there, and it sounds really similar, one can almost imagine the augmented fifth there, it is possible to consider it as the polite cousin of our chord. The same is true for when our chord appears in major keys, where the fifth is not augmented, but rather a normal perfect fifth. However, since all the other features are there, the effect of the chord is similar, only with a brighter color. The last feature we should address is which specific bass note precedes our chord. While in most cases, as you saw, the bass was on the second degree, there are other options. For example, the bass could be on the raised seventh degree of the scale and then leap to the third degree, typically with some little ornament, like in this example by Pierre Dumage. This option, along with some others, are less common in the literature. We will discuss them later in connection to the way musicians and theorists perceived this chord in the 18th century. As you see, we are not talking about one specific chord that can be used in only one way, but a family of chords that all share that very distinctive and French bite. Looking for ways to explain how this chord is formed, we notice that in almost all the cases we've seen, our chord was somehow part of a cadence. Let's see how we can analyze it from the perspectives of 17th century cadences and counterpoint. In past episodes, we discussed the cadenza doppia, which we also called the four-step cadence. Here is the most common variant of it. And here it has a prepared dissonance of a seventh, also an extremely common variant already from the 16th century. We also showed how by changing the bass, one may arrive at interesting results. For example, like this. Or even like this. This technique of altering the bass can produce surprising and dissonant results, like these parallel sevenths. Starting from the 16th century and for a long time after, composers played around with this concept, arriving at many different results. However, it was specifically some French composers around the middle of the 17th century who thought to try this version out, with the bass starting on the third degree. In context and with more voices, it sounds a bit better. And this is how an innocent cadenza doppia probably ended up creating our beloved French chord. Now, like any contrapuntal structure, it may be modified heavily. We can, for example, double its duration and add more notes, and avoid the augmented fifth. Or have only the augmented fifth, with some ornaments, making it sound almost like real French music. And like every cadence, it may be evaded in many different ways. For example, instead of leaping to the first degree with our bassitans, we can ascend a semitone and lead to a new cadence to G minor. Or, more cunningly, altering the cantizans at the last moment in order to make it a preparation for another cadence, this time to G major, with another instance of our French chord, this time in its major variant. If you think I'm just playing around, see this excerpt from a piece by Gaspard Corrette, where he uses our chord 3 times in a row by continuously evading the cadences. Now that we understand how this chord works, we can go back and look for its origins, its appearances in treatises, and even its historical name. According to what we know, the earliest use of this chord as we understand it is found in pieces by Louis Couperin from around the 1650s, like the one we presented in the beginning. As not much keyboard music from the middle of the century survived, we can't say for sure whether he was the one who invented it. But a published letter from 1680 may contain an interesting insight. In the letter, a certain connoisseur of music explained the current state of music in France. He explains that the various methods of playing harpsichord can be reduced to 2 schools led by 2 composers, both dead by that time. The first is of Jacques Champion de Chambonnières, with his fine and pleasing style that contains natural, tender, and well-turned melodies. And the second is of Louis Couperin, whose style was admired by connoisseurs because it was full of chords and enriched with fine dissonances, with structural niceties and with imitation. Interestingly, when looking at the music of Chambonnières, I couldn't find examples of our beloved chord. Could it be that the chords enriched with fine dissonances attributed to Couperin might have something to do with our dissonant chord, which evidently wasn't Chambonnières' cup of tea? Another composer from around the same time who might conform to Chambonnières' taste is the famous Jean-Baptiste Lully. We showed before an example by him, but it was the softer variant of our chord, without the augmented fifth. The other variants that include the augmented fifth are not part of Lully's harmonic language. It might be that this naughty addition of the augmented fifth is a marker that can differentiate between coexisting French musical tastes. However, after the death of Chambonnières and Lully, it is very difficult to find composers that did not use our chord. Perhaps the fine and pleasing style fell out of fashion, clearing the stage for those who enjoyed the dissonant augmented fifth. More explicit sources that may help us understand our chord in its historical context are music treatises. For example, Guillaume Gabriel Niver wrote in his composition treatise of 1667 that the augmented fifth is not used in practice. However, 22 years later, in his Little Basso Continuo treatise, in a time where our chord with its distinct augmented fifth can already be found under every rock, he had to include it. He regarded some basso continuo figures as extraordinary, not in the sense that they are special, just that they are not so common. One of these is the quinte superflu, the augmented fifths, that according to his demonstration should be realized by adding a third and a ninth. Let's hear some of his example. One year later, in a treatise by Denis Delaire, we get a more explicit instruction to accompany the figure of the augmented fifth with the third and seventh or ninth, although in his example he uses both seventh and ninth. In future basso continuo treatises, similar statements appear. In other treatises, we see how to employ the augmented fifth, which in practice would imply our chord, in composition. For example, in 1699, Charles Masson explained that the voice that will create the augmented fifth should leap to it from either a minor third or a diminished fifth above. As you see, and this conforms to many of the examples we saw, the augmented fifth is approached without preparation. The next interesting reference to our chord is found in François Campion's important treatise from 1716, where he presented for the first time the règle d'octave, the rule of the octave. In it, he shows our chord in the context of a harmonic progression and verifies what we already knew, that it is made on the third degree of the minor scale. He also adds, "I find this chord rough and confusing. The art consists in knowing where to place it in order to make it effective." 2 years later, Jean-François Dondrieu summarized all the information about this chord, now officially referred to as accord de la quinte superflue, the chord of the augmented fifth. Interestingly, one of his examples is in a major key. As we said, when the corresponding chord appears in a major key, there is no augmented fifth, just a normal perfect fifth. And now we arrive at Jean-Philippe Rameau's famous Traité de l'harmonie from 1722, which not only revolutionized music theory, but also specifically the way one may understand our chord. To make things easy for us, we'll try to avoid getting into Rameau's concept of fundamental bass. We'll leave this for another occasion. Rather early in his book, he presents a diagram of what he believed to be the main force behind any piece of music, the dominant seventh chord. It is found on the fifth degree of the scale, in this case of a minor scale, and as shown in the diagram, may be inverted, producing a total of 4 forms. Now, below its fundamental form, Rameau shows that one may add under it a fa, that is, a bass on the third degree of the minor scale, creating the chord of the augmented fifth. In other words, according to Rameau, our chord is nothing more than a dominant seventh chord with an added bass. This process of adding a foreign bass below the harmony is called supposition by Rameau. And in fact, it's the only way in his system to achieve a chord with an augmented fifth, as well as other chords with ninths. And so, Rameau demonstrates how this progression can be altered with the new bass that will produce the chord of the augmented fifth. As you can see, and is also explicitly noted by Rameau, the step before the augmented fifth chord is on the second degree of the scale, as we've seen in most examples. Here is another example, not by Rameau, but that follows the same idea. A standard Baroque sequence, with a new bass that creates our chord. And here you can hear a very similar progression in an actual piece by Gaspard Leroux from 1705. Rameau mentions that our chord may also be prepared by itself, that is, prepared on one of the inversions of the dominant seventh chord, then sustained over the bass on the third degree, and then resolved according to the normal rules. Lastly, Rameau presents a more modern variant to the augmented fifth chord that employs a flattened fourth instead of the third. Rameau considers it as nearly the same as the more common variant. Many French writers accepted Rameau's theories and during the following decades presented our chord accordingly, based on the idea of supposition. One might say that this chord of the augmented fifth is the quintessential harmony of the French Baroque. It is extraordinary that non-French composers barely touched it, and non-French theorists only started discussing it seriously towards the middle of the 18th century, after it had been in use for almost a century. To finish our episode, let's see how this chord was described by the English traveler Charles Burney. Charles Burney, it should be said, did not appreciate French Baroque music and wrote about it retrospectively in 1776. When describing Rameau's opera Castor et Pollux, which according to him has been long regarded in France as the masterpiece of this composer, he complains that the abundant use of appoggiaturas impedes the motion of the air and gives it a slow and languid effect, however lively the theme on which it is composed. Burney then describes one passage in detail. The Prélude tendre at the opening of the third act abounds with too many of these drags, which, being equally harsh to the ear and injurious to pulsation, seem to prevent the performer from ever falling on his feet. And bar 11th, the chord of the superfluous fifth, which makes all nature shudder except our Gallic neighbors, is here continued so long that it distorts the countenance of every other hearer, like Iera Picra. Let's listen to the excerpt described here by Burney. Whether you agree with Burney or not, it is clear that our augmented fifth is something that cannot be ignored, even if it was used, astonishingly, practically only by French composers. Well, of course, there are a few exceptions. We collected some in the appendix you can check out. As part of a larger effort to define the theoretical models that make French Baroque sound so unique, my former professor Johannes Menke named our beloved chord Le Cri, the cry. Check the footnotes to learn more. This was our episode about the most French chord. We hope you enjoyed it. Many thanks to Johannes Menke and Adam Slimani who helped me write this episode, and to Josef Laming for playing the organ. If you enjoy early music sources, feel free to support us on Patreon. Comment, share and like. See you next time at earlymusicsources.com.